Howdy folks, Kevin here, coming at you today with another article review. This time it's a little bit different. Instead of reviewing an article on testing, I'm going to take some time to review an article from 2019 by Chris Coyier of CSS Tricks fame and just general front-end development fame about the Great Divide. And I'm actually supposed to be doing some React tutorials, and I came across this article because I'm trying to catch up on React. I knew React 3 years ago, and now I don't know React anymore, apparently. That's how fast this industry changes, and this article kind of hits on that. I was looking up something about, I think, Redux, and ran across a Dev2 article that linked to this one, and as soon as I saw this line, 2 front-end developers are sitting at a bar, they have nothing to talk about, I was like, okay, I have to read this. And about 3 paragraphs in, I was like, okay, I have to do an article review about this. It's so true. So let's get to it. Let's say there is a divide happening in front-end development. I feel it, but it's not just in my bones. Based on an awful lot of written developer sentiment, interviews Dave Rupert and I have done on Shop Talk and in-person discussions, it's, as they say, a thing. The divide is between people who self-identify as or have the job title of front-end developer, yet have divergent skill sets. On one side, an army of developers whose interests, responsibilities, and skill sets are heavily revolved around JavaScript. And then on the other side is an army of developers whose interests, responsibilities, and skill sets are focused on other areas of the front end, like HTML, CSS, design, interaction, patterns, accessibility, etc. So this is the divide between your primary JavaScript developers and your primary UX developers, and that's some job title he'll mention later. I think it's very apt, and let's keep going through. In response to our post, What Makes a Good Front-End Developer, Stephen Davis wrote, I think we need he's quoting, he's quoting the article, which the article said, and by the way, there are so many good links to articles, I might have to review all the articles. I don't know how I'm going to do all that. I think we need to move away from the term myself. We should split into UX engineers and JavaScript engineers. They are different mindsets. Most people are not amazing at both JavaScript and CSS. Let UX engineers who work closely with UX design to create great designs, interactions, prototypes, etc., and let JavaScript engineers handle all the data parts. The data parts, that's the big difference in JavaScript these days, is it involves so much more data management. Most people are not amazing at both JavaScript and CSS. That I would have highly objected to 10 years ago. I think there would have been amazing people at both JavaScript and CSS. That was the front-end developer job, was being really good at JavaScript, being really good at CSS. The divide came in when so much of the back-end more analytical data management stuff moved to front-end code being React, Node.js, all that. And so JavaScript suddenly just exploded in what you can do with it and added so much more. So in order to be a JavaScript developer, you now have to have this huge breadth of knowledge that involves a lot of data management, programming experience, whereas before you didn't. Now, you can be amazing at JavaScript these days and CSS, I think. It's just you're not going to be amazing at the heavy programming side of JavaScript and writing CSS that actually looks like what the design says that it should look like. So sick of being great at CSS but being forced into JavaScript. I'm not a programmer. I've heard this from many people. I like JavaScript. I like the programming aspect of it, but I can definitely see if you're a traditional CSS focused developer and now you're having to compete on a job that wasn't a thing 5 years ago, that's basically taken over your job title, which is kind of what happened. It took over the job title of front-end engineer, front-end developer. It's really frustrating. The schism isn't happening under our feet. We're asking for it. I heard it's called an identity crisis for the first time in Vernon Joyce's article, Is Front-End Development Having an Identity Crisis? He points to the major JavaScript frameworks. Frameworks like Angular or libraries like React require developers to have a much deeper understanding of programming concepts that might have historically been only associated with the backend. MVC, functional programming, higher order functions, hoisting, hard concepts to grasp if your background is in HTML, CSS, and basic interactive JavaScript. This rings true for me. I enjoy working with and reading about modern frameworks, fancy build tools, and interesting data layer strategies. Right now, I'm enjoying working with React as a UI library, Apollo GraphQL for data, Cypress for integration testing, and Webpack as a build tool. I am constantly eyeing up CSS and JavaScript libraries, yet while I do consider those things to be part of front-end development, they feel cosmically far away from the articles and conversations around accessibility, semantic markup, CSS possibilities, UX considerations, and UI polish, among others. Feels like two different worlds. Very much so. Gosh, I'm so tired of accessibility being just bulldozed over because JavaScript developers or full stack developers never took the time to care. I mean, it was one thing when it was us doing it to ourselves. It seemed like it was more of an ignorance thing. Now it seems more like they just don't care. They just don't care. Maybe that's a mean thing to say. I'm going to leave it in, but fight me and prove me wrong. When companies post job openings for front-end developers, what are they really asking for? Assuming they actually know that the title front-end developer alone isn't doing enough. It's likely more helpful to know which side of the divide they need the most. So you have two different developers. You have one focused on the JavaScript side, React, GraphQL. Okay, it is Apollo GraphQL. I tried to be fast, and I'm just ending up taking such a long time on this. Those things versus like things like interaction design and SVG. Try and get a JavaScript developer who's focused on programming to do SVG. I bet they're going to struggle with it. But if you get good SVG on your site, it can really make that site, as designers love to use the phrase, pop. CSS, SaaS architecture, WordPress themes, light jQuery, UX and accessibility focused. Funny they say light jQuery. It's still a thing. It's pretty fun. My hope is that the solution is writing more descriptive job postings. If clearly defined and agreed upon job titles are too much of an ask for the industry at large, and I fear that it is, we can still use our words. Stop using ask as a noun. It's not a noun. It's a verb. I don't want to hear you say, what is your ask? Makes it sound like you're an asshole. Corey Ginnivan put it well. I'd love more job descriptions to be more vulnerable and open. Let people know what you want to achieve, specify what they'll be working on, but open it as a growth opportunity for both parties. I think it's a pretty cool idea. But I'm going to skip past. Here is a front-end developer job post. I'm not going to read through it, but basically they were just showing off their job post from years past. And you notice here, front-end developer, but it's focused on React and GraphQL, as well as it says you're HTML, CSS, and design competent. Not that you're an expert at it, but you're competent at it. I think that's fine. I think it's fine to be a JavaScript developer who's competent at HTML and CSS. I think you have to be competent at it. You don't have to be an expert at it, but you do need to be competent at it. And likewise, you can be a UX engineer and be JavaScript competent. You don't have to know how to build a huge React application, but you should be able to make a React component or at least work within the React ecosystem. Front-end developer is still a useful term. Like Mina Markham described to us recently, it's who people that primarily work with browsers and people using those browsers are. But it's a generic shorthand, says Miriam Suzanne. Front-end developer is shorthand for when the details don't matter, like being in an indie rock band. Who knows what that is? But I say it all the time. Shorthand is great until you're posting a job description. When the details matter, we already have a more detailed language. We just have to use it. Yeah, I think I agree with this sentiment. I think it's fine to have both front-end developer in the same way that I would describe myself as a software developer to anybody not familiar with the engine with the industry. So I think you can just kind of go through multiple levels of specificity. So software developer, well, okay, I'm a front-end developer. Well, actually, I'm a UX engineer or a JavaScript developer. To put a point on this divide a bit more, consider this article by Trey Huffine, a recap of front-end development in 2018. It's very well done. It points to big moments this year. This was written in 2019. So anyway, shows interesting data and makes predictions about what we might see next year. But it's entirely based around the JavaScript ecosystem. HTML is only mentioned in the context of JavaScript-powered static site generators, and CSS is only mentioned in the context of CSS and JavaScript. It's front-end development, but perhaps only one half of it, the JavaScript half. If you read that summary and don't connect with much in there, then my advice would be, that's okay. You can still be a front-end developer. Thanks, Chris. You might be exploring layout possibilities, architecting a CSS or design system, getting deep into UX, building interesting animations, digging into accessibility, or any number of firmly front-end development jobs. There's more than enough to go around. Remember just how last year, Frank Chimero, who builds incredibly great websites for himself and clients, was totally bewildered with where front-end development had gone? To summarize, other people's tool chains are absolutely inscrutable from the outside. Even getting started is touchy. Last month, I had to install a package manager to install a package manager. That's when I closed my laptop and slowly backed away from it. We're a long way from the CSS Zen Garden where I started. CSS Zen Garden. I feel like knowing CSS Zen Garden was such a huge benefit when you would go in for an interview and like you could geek out about CSS Zen Garden with the hiring manager or the other developers, and like they knew, they're like, oh, you're one of those developers that actually cares about this. Now if you mention it, people will be like, what? Huh? Side tangent. I feel like my skills are just constantly being devalued and becoming out of date. Like I spent a year and a half doing Angular 1.3. I learned a ton of good stuff about Angular and programming in general. That's where I got started with unit testing and actually front-end testing. But now, like, who's going to hire me for an Angular 1.3 job? Nobody. And I don't even want to work on an Angular 1.3 job because it's going to be so out of date and probably a legacy application, and it's not going to be very fun. So it's just this push and pull between moving the industry forward and constantly fighting to prove your worth in a very competitive industry. And it's not a problem that it's competitive. I actually like that it's competitive. It'd be bad if it weren't competitive. It'd mean that it become stale and things just weren't improving. But I think we need to take time to almost mourn the fact that all these skills and all these things that we're learning are just going away. Could you imagine that in any other industry? If you were a musician and you're playing a guitar, and then all of a sudden the guitar just becomes out of date and you have to learn this brand new guitar, and things are mostly the same, but like you were playing beautiful music before and it sounded really good, but you know, it wasn't as nice as this other instrument. But there's nowhere in the industry, I think, for playing that old guitar. That old guitar has been thrown out. It's gone. Nobody is ever going to pay you to play that old guitar. And that's good. It means that we're making progress. I mean, technology and music is vastly different things, but I think we as an industry need to mourn that a little bit more and be more open about this as an industry culture, that this is tough. This is very tough to work day in and day out, have the projects you're working on replaced, and have the technology that you know just fall out from beneath you, and you have to relearn again and again and again. Yeah, I think we need to make more room for that. A long way indeed. I might argue that you don't have to care. If you've been and continue to be successful building websites any way you know how for yourself and clients, hallelujah. Consider all this new toolchain stuff entirely as an opt-in deal that solves different problems than you have. And yet, this toolchain opaqueness prods at even the people necessarily embedded in it. Dave Rupert documents a real bug with a solution buried so deep that it's a miracle it was rooted out. Then he laments, as tool chains grow and become more complex, unless you are expertly familiar with them, it's very unclear what transformations are happening in our code. Tracking the differences between the input and output and the processes that code underwent can be overwhelming. Who needs these big tool chains? Generally, it's the big sites. It's a bit tricky to pin down what big means, but I bet you have a good feel for it. Ironically, with heaps of tooling add complexity. The reason they are used is for battling complexity. Sometimes it feels like releasing cougars into the forest to handle your snake problem, and now you have a cougar problem. The most visible discussions around all of this are dominated by people at the companies that are working on these big and complex sites. Bastian Algier wrote, "Big teams need X. That's why X is the best solution for everyone. I think this is highly toxic for smaller teams with different requirements and definitions of what's maintainable or sustainable. I get in touch with a lot of smaller agencies and freelancers from all over the world, and it's interesting how their work is often completely detached from the web's VIP circus." What's going on here? What happened? Where did this divide come from? The answer is pretty clear to me. JavaScript done got big. So big. It's everywhere on front-end websites. The major JavaScript front-end frameworks are seeing explosive growth and dominating job postings. These frameworks are used by loads of teams to power loads of websites. Native JavaScript is evolving quickly as well, which has a lot of people excited. It powers backends too. Your site might be powered by or involve a Node.js server. Your build process is likely to be powered by JavaScript. Third-party JavaScript powers so many front-end features, from a site's ad network and analytics to full-blown features like reviews, comments, and related content. Concepts like node-powered cloud functions, storage, and authentication, combined with low-cost and low-effort scalable hosting, have empowered the crap out of JavaScript front-end developers. They can use their skills exclusively to ship entire functional products. A front-end developer with a strong JavaScript skill set is wildly empowered these days. I've been calling it the all-powerful front-end developer, and I did a whole talk on it. Through all the possibilities that swirl around the idea of serverless combined with prepackaged UI frameworks, a front-end developer can build just about anything without needing much, if any, help from other disciplines. I find it exciting and enticing, but also worthy of pause. It's certainly possible that you become so framework-driven going down this path that your wider problem-solving skills suffer. I heard the sentiment from Estelle Wheel, who goes so far as to say she thinks of developers more as framework implementers, reserving the title of engineer for tool-agnostic problem solvers. This front-end empowerment is very real. Particularly in the last few years, front-end developers have gotten especially powerful. So powerful that Michael Scharnagel, God, I'm so bad with last names. I'm so sorry. He says that he's seen companies shift their hiring in that direction. What I'm seeing is that many developers focus entirely on JavaScript nowadays, and I see companies where they replace back-end developers with JavaScript developers. What some don't understand is that a JavaScript developer is not per se a front-end developer. A JavaScript developer may not like to write CSS or care about semantics. That's the same way I prefer not to work directly with databases or configure a server. That's okay. What's not okay is if you don't want to use something and at the same time tell others what they do is easy or useless. Even worse is if you try to tell experts in their field that they're doing it all wrong and that they should do it your way. That's opinionated. And Jay Freestone takes a stab at why. Over the last few years, we've started to see a significant shift in the role of the front-end developer. As applications have become increasingly JavaScript heavy, there has been a necessity for front-end engineers to understand and practice architectural principles that were traditionally in the domain of back-end developers such as API design and data modeling. Very, 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 very true. And also, I keep seeing job descriptions for a front-end developer, and it lists nothing about anything front-end. No HTML, no CSS, no browsers, no accessibility, no UX, nothing. And I'm like, that's not a front-end developer. The point of the front end is that you're the front end of the website. You are the presentation of the website. You're not just the server. I don't need to know API design to be a front-end developer. That's back-end. End of story. It's happened even with my own small-scale work. I do like API design sometimes. We were looking for a back-end Go developer to help evolve our web services at CodePen. When we didn't have a lot of luck finding the perfect person, we decided to go another direction. We saw that our stack was evolving into something that's extremely welcoming to JavaScript-focused front-end developers to the point where we could easily put more of them to work right away. So that's what we did. There may be a cyclical nature to some of this as well. We're seeing coding schools absolutely explode and produce fairly talented front-end developers in less than a year. These code school graduates are filling labor gaps, but more importantly, as Brad Westphal tells me, starting to lead industry discussions rather than be passive followers of them. And make no mistake, these schools are producing developers on the JavaScript side of the divide. Every single code school web development curriculum I've seen treats HTML, CSS, UI, UX, accessibility topics as early fundamentals that students breeze through, or they are sprinkled in as asides while JavaScript dominates the later curriculum. Can you come in and teach our students all the layout concepts in 3 hours? Jesus. This is actually a really important point, and one that I think you end up feeling a little hurt when you've been pushing this front-end discipline, trying to encourage good things and helping these newcomers along, and then it feels like they go, thanks for the help, go away, I'm the captain now. Feels like that, and that sucks. Because these things, especially this thing, is incredibly important, and I don't think people get that. When JavaScript dominates the conversations around the front end, it leads to some developers feeling inadequate. In a comment on Robin Rendell's, can I see just my name in here? Because I think I can pronounce that right. Front-end development is not a problem to be solved. Nils writes, maybe the term front-end developer needs some rethinking. When I started working, front-end was mostly HTML, CSS, and some JavaScript. A good front-end developer needed to be able to translate a Photoshop layout to a pixel-perfect website. Front-end today is much, much more. If you want to learn front-end development, people seem to start learning Git, NPM, Angular, React, Vue, and all of this is called front-end development. I'm a designer, and I think I'm pretty good at HTML and CSS, but that's not enough anymore to be a front-end developer. Very true. Robin himself gave himself the job title, adult boy that cares too much about accessibility and CSS and component design, but doesn't really care one bit about GraphQL or Rails or Redux, but I feel really bad about not caring about this other stuff too. That's the problem, is that you feel really bad about not caring. And I think maybe that's something we have to come to terms in the UX engineer industry. I really like the term UX engineer. I think that's really good. It's also frustrating to people in other ways. Remember Laura Shanks, God save me, story of going in for a job interview? She met 90% of the listed qualifications, only had to have the interview involve JavaScript algorithms. She ultimately didn't get the job because of that. Not everybody needs to get every job interview they interview for, but the issue here is that front-end developer isn't communicating what it needs to as an effective job title. Blah. That's awful. I don't know, why does the industry have this problem? Like, it's talked about so much. What makes me good at my job is my ability to problem solve and figure out how to make things work together. I'm not good at my job because I can recite very specific information about a very specific tool or a very specific programming problem. And so it's so cheapening to be in an interview and being asked this questions and just being going, you don't know what you're interviewing for. You don't know what you want out of a developer. What you want is someone who can problem solve, who can figure out why the code isn't working, even though they don't necessarily know what that code is, because the code is way bigger than any one person can work on. And what you need is people who can figure that out, can use other people's code that's broken in some way and figure out why. What you don't need are individual implementers of very specific things. That's the only thing they ever focus on, is this very specific problem, and they're really good at it. It just doesn't happen. Feels like an alternate universe some days. Yes. Two front-end web developers can be standing right next to each other and have very little, if any, skill sets in common. That's downright bizarre to me for a job title so specific and ubiquitous. Yeah, it's different than just saying you're a software developer. Like, software developer can be any number of languages. To narrow it down to front-end web developer and still have people who can't communicate. Even if you took like a Vue developer and a React developer, they would have a hard time talking together. Or if you took a React developer from 2016, brought them, somehow time traveled them to talk to the React developer from today, but maybe that React developer's memory was wiped from 2018 and back, maybe 2020 and back. Okay, for them, we'll do 2021 and back, because who wants to remember 2020? And you have them try to talk to each other. The same person. They're going to be like, oh yeah, this is how I build my React components. And he's like, React components? What are those? I've never heard of React components. It's all React hooks. That's how you do React. Like, that's crazy that it's so different in 5 years. I'm sure that's already the case with a job title like designer, but front-end web developer is a niche within a niche already. Gina Ann is a front-end developer and a designer I admire. Yet, in a panel discussion I was on with her a few years ago, she admits she doesn't think of herself with that title. When I was at Apple, my job title when I first started out there was front-end developer. Would I call myself that now? No, because it's become such a different thing. Like, I learned HTML and CSS. I never learned JavaScript, but I knew enough to work around it. Now we're talking about job titles. When I hear front-end developer, I'm going to assume you know a lot more than me. It seems like, at the time, the lack of JavaScript focus made Gina feel like she's less skilled than someone who has the official title of front-end developer. I think people would be lucky to have the skills that Gina has in her left pinky finger, but hey, that's just me. Speaking to Gina recently, she says she still avoids the title specifically because it leads to incorrect assumptions about her skill set. Mandy Michael put a point on this better than anyone in her article. Is there any value in people who cannot write JavaScript? What I don't understand is why it's okay if you can just write JavaScript, but somehow you're not good enough if you just write HTML and CSS. When every new website on the internet has perfect semantic, accessible HTML and an exceptionally executed, accessible CSS that works on every device and browsers, then you can tell me that those languages are not valuable on their own. Until then, we need to stop devaluing CSS and HTML. Yes, stop devaluing it. Mandy uses her post for peacemaking. I didn't sound very peaceful in my reading of it. She's telling us, yes, there is a divide, but no, neither side is any more valuable than the other. Another source of frustration is when the Great Divide leads to poor craftsmanship. This is what I see as the cause of most of the jeering and poking that occurs across aisles. Brad Frost, I even know how to pronounce that name and I didn't pronounce it right. Brad Frost points to the term full-stack developer as a little misleading. In my experience, full-stack developers always translates to programmers who can do front-end code because they have to and it's easy. It's never the other way around. The term full-stack developer implies that a developer is equally adept at both front-end code and back-end code, but I've never in my personal experience witnessed anyone who truly fits that description. Me too, buddy. Never seen it. Haydon Pickering says something similar. When you're hired at this mythical high level, something like HTML is unlikely to be a strong suit. One of the most glaring issues with making full-stack developers the gatekeepers of all things code is the pitiful quality of the HTML output. Most come from a computer science background, and document structure is simply not taught alongside control structure. It's not their competency, but we still make it their job. And I can just hear voices in there going, yeah, but it's HTML. Like, how hard is HTML? Well, if you want to write it accessibly, it's hard. If you want to write it in a way that helps with SEO, that's hard. If you want to write it in a way that reduces file size, that's hard. If you want to write it in a way that fits very well into a React component system, that's tough. So yeah, let's care about HTML again. Just like it might not be my job to configure our deployment pipeline and handle our database scaling, I do a terrible job if that task fell to me. Perhaps it's best to leave the job of HTML and CSS to do those who do it well. Maybe it's easier to say, even if there is a divide, that doesn't absolve any of us from doing a good job. I remember a job interview I was in for kind of a JavaScript, I thought it was front-end developer, and they asked me some question about how to update a database to make sure that it doesn't overwrite stuff. And I was just like, I don't know. I would ask the database person. Like, that's not my job. I could try to figure it out, but with something like updating a database, I don't want to mess it up. So I would just ask the database person. It turns out I was supposed to be the database person, which now it blows my mind because this was a front-end developer job. I don't know why it was listed as that. Just as architecture and developer ergonomics are all of our jobs, we should view performance, accessibility, and user experience in our line of work. If we can't do a good job with any particular part of it, make sure there's someone else who can do that part. Nobody is allowed to do a bad job. It's worth mentioning that there are plenty of developers with skill sets that cross the divide and do so gracefully. I think of our own Sarah Drasner, who is known as an incredible animator, SVG expert, and a core team member of Vue who also works at Microsoft on Azure. Full stack indeed. I expand upon a lot of these topics in another recent conference talk I gave at WordCamp US. I wonder how many times that mistake has been made. Is there any solution to these problems of suffering craftsmanship and skilled evaluation? Are the problems systemic and deeply rooted, or are they surface level and without severe consequence? Is the divide real or a temporary rift? Is the friction settling down or heating up? Will the front-end developer skill set widen or narrow as the years pass? Let's keep talking about this. Even as JavaScript continues heating up, Rachel Andrew tells me it used to be hard to fill a CSS workshop, but these days conference organizers are asking for them as they are in hot demand. Like old Heraclitus likes to say, the only constant is change. Okay, so that's the article. There were a couple good comments that I wanted to go through as well. A couple more things I wanted to mention actually before we get to the comments is we used to make fun of back in the days divitis, where it was just div. Just nested and nested and nested. And then like people figured it out and it was okay. And now it's back. And now I see things like a UX design where it's a table and they make the top row a table with headers and then the rest they just do divs. It's like, you're not using HTML like you should be using HTML. It's basic table design. You're supposed to be good at this. Why are you messing this up so bad? Or form fields just completely messed up. It's not that difficult to know that you need to put a label associated with a form field. That is such basic knowledge if you spend any significant amount of time in learning. Like, that's one of the first things you learn in any accessibility training. You take a 30-minute class on accessibility, you learn form labels associate with form inputs. And it's not like, there are some tricky things with accessibility. That's not one of them. If you work on a website and you are anything above a junior and you don't know that, I have opinions. The other thing I wanted to say was, I think these UX engineer jobs are there, and as mentioned with the CSS workshop, in higher demand than ever. I just think like they grew like this, and then there was this giant cloud of developer jobs that sat right on top of it. And so now, instead of when you're looking for a job, you're looking at this much. Now you're looking at this much. And so there's all this more noise in the front-end developer job posting side of things than there used to be. And I think that's really what's going on. It's not that the UX or CSS developer job demand has shrunken. It's that it's just been overwhelmed with inappropriate job titles. Okay, here was the one comment that I really wanted to look at. Now I have to learn React just so my entire career doesn't become limited. I have a decade of experience to offer, but none of it matters because I'm not an expert in these libraries that nobody needed 5 years ago. I don't have anything against the libraries themselves. They're super useful sometimes, but I don't like how they let people effectively ignore 66% of what makes up the web. It's because it's HTML, CSS, JavaScript. I think JavaScript is now probably 60% of what makes up the web, and I think Chris mentioned that earlier in the article. So I would say HTML and CSS is more like 40%, but still, that's a large swath of what makes a good functioning website that people just ignore. So I'm going to end it there. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope, it wasn't necessarily front-end testing, but it is kind of in the same realm. What are your thoughts on this? So this was written in 2019. It's been over 3.5 years since this was written. So much has changed since then. I wonder if he's put something else out. I haven't really looked. What are your thoughts on it? Let me know in the comments below. And until next time, have fun doing front end development.